Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, Supporting Young Children and Immigrant Families, What Early Childhood Stakeholders Need to Know. My name is Wendy Cervantes, and I'm a Senior Policy Analyst for Immigration and Immigrant Families with the Center for Law and Social Policy, or CLASP, and I'll be serving as your moderator. CLASP is a national, nonpartisan, anti-poverty organization that advocates for public policies that improve the lives of poor people and create ladders to economic security for all. We target large-scale opportunities to reform federal and state programs, funding, and service systems, then work on the ground for effective implementation. On behalf of CLASP, I want to thank all of you for joining us today. Today, we're going to be focusing on how the new immigration enforcement orders introduced by the Trump administration earlier this year impact the safety, health, and overall development of young children and immigrant families. I'm sure many of you are aware of the immigration raids that have swept the country over the past few months and have seen the fear that these raids have created amongst immigrant communities. Our goal today is to provide you with information and resources to help you better support children and families in your programs who may be at risk of immigration enforcement. I also just want to acknowledge that we're very excited about how many of you signed up today as we exceeded our capacity. Therefore, we recognize that you all represent a wide range of expertise and experiences, and we'll do our best to get to as many of your questions as possible within the next hour. But please know that this is only the beginning of the conversation, and we look forward to being a resource for you in the future. We're also fortunate to be joined by a set of incredible experts, including Hannah Matthews, our Director of Child Care and Early Education at CLASP, Emily Butera, Senior Program Officer for the Women's Refugee Commission, and Elisa Ortiz, Director of Network Coordination at Appleseed. Before we begin, I'd like to quickly mention some housekeeping items regarding what you can expect over the course of today's one-hour webinar. As you join the webinar, your phone lines were automatically muted and will remain muted for the duration of the webinar. We will save time at the end to take questions from the audience. To submit questions, please send them via the chat box. You can also use the chat box to alert us regarding any technical issues you're experiencing. The presentation and recording will be available after the webinar on our website at clasp.org. Next slide, please. Great. In terms of an overview, here are some of the key questions we plan to address today. First, who are the young children impacted by immigration enforcement policies, and how do these policies impact child well-being? Second, what are current early childhood policies and eligibility rules related to children and immigrant families? Third, how do the new executive orders change immigration enforcement policy? Finally, we'll also address how early childhood stakeholders can support children and families and share new resources. And then we'll have time to answer questions from you. Next slide, please. Now let me go over some terms we'll be using when we talk about children impacted by immigration enforcement. There are three key categories of children, starting with children in mixed status families, which are children living with at least one undocumented parent. Currently, more than 5 million children in the U.S. live in mixed status families, 4.1 million of whom are U.S. citizens. These are the children who are now at greater risk of losing a parent to deportation, and these are also the kids most likely to be served by child care and early education programs, as the vast majority of young children of immigrants live in mixed status families. Next slide. Next are undocumented children, which are the children living in the U.S. without legal authorization, often referred to as dreamers. It's estimated that there are just under 1 million children under the age of 18 who are undocumented themselves. These are also the young people who have been beneficiaries of President Obama's 2012 Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program, which provided work permits and temporary reprieve from deportation to certain young people brought to the U.S. as children. The future of this program under President Trump remains uncertain. Next slide. Finally, U.S. who have no lawful immigration status in the U.S., have not attained 18 years of age, and who have no parent or legal guardian in the U.S. or have no parent or legal guardian in the U.S. available to provide care in physical custody. While there has been a significant increase in the number of unaccompanied children entering the U.S. in recent years, these children are less likely to be represented in child care and early education programs. But it is important to note that more young children have been migrating alone in recent years, and unaccompanied children are particularly at risk under the new immigration orders. Next slide. I also want to touch briefly on what the research tells us about how immigration enforcement policies can harm a child's healthy development. First, we know that enforcement can separate families by deporting parents, an outcome that can have serious implications for child well-being, whether parents take their child with them or leave them behind, including increased risk of entering the child welfare system. Second, losing a parent to deportation, or even just the constant fear of possibly losing a parent, can harm a child's short and long-term mental and physical health, and can also increase stress among parents and other family members. In fact, one study found that more than 3/4 of children with undocumented parents suffered from symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. Also, a parent's deportation can undermine a family's economic security through the sudden loss of income, especially when the primary breadwinner is deported, which can lead to children experiencing more hunger and housing instability. Third, we also know that ramped-up deportation creates a chilling effect, which can result in families being reluctant to carry out basic everyday activities, such as taking their children to school, and can also make parents fearful of engaging with government agencies, which can further limit children's access to critical health care and nutrition assistance. All of these consequences pose a significant risk to a child's long-term health, educational outcomes, and success later in life, and something all early childhood stakeholders need to be concerned about. With that, I'll now turn it over to Hannah Matthews, who will provide an overview of current early childhood policies and eligibility rules. Hannah?
Thanks, Wendy. I'm going to briefly provide an overview of immigrant eligibility for childcare and early education. CLASP has conducted research previously on barriers that immigrant families face in accessing quality early childhood programs. You can go to the next slide, please. Immigrants now make up a quarter of all children of immigrants make up a quarter of all young children in the United States. So access to early childhood programs should be an important issue for all of us in the early childhood field. Immigrant families, in particular low-income immigrant families, face many of the same barriers that other low-income families face, which include affordability, shortage of available programs that meet parents' needs, and so on. But many immigrant families face additional barriers, often related to lack of English language skills, to be aware of the availability of programs, or to understand eligibility or enrollment policies, a lack of culturally competent providers to provide care for their children, and barriers related to immigration status. Next slide. Rules around immigrant eligibility and restrictions to services are based on funding streams, as well as the settings in which services are delivered. So it's really important to know the funding source to understand whether restrictions apply. The federal government sets eligibility for federal programs. States are not permitted to put in place additional restrictions or barriers. One issue that has come up since the beginning of the current administration is whether and how states or localities can be coerced into sharing information about immigrant families' utilization of programs or services with the federal government. The major early childhood programs, which we'll go into detail on, Head Start and Child Care Assistance, have protections in place to not share confidential and personally identifiable information about children and families. The specifics of those protections may differ, but in general, early childhood programs should not be requesting sensitive information related to the immigration status of household members. This is something we will be monitoring closely going forward because we know there are a number of concerns. Next slide. So moving on to specifics. The Supreme Court has ruled that all children in the United States, regardless of their citizenship or immigration status, are entitled to equal access to a basic public education. While the court ruled on K-12 education, school districts generally follow the same policies related to immigrant children in pre-kindergarten. Federal civil rights law and regulations prohibit schools from discriminating against students, including on the basis of national origin. They also cannot deny enrollment on the basis of citizenship or immigration status, or because a family does not provide a birth certificate or has a foreign birth certificate. Next slide, please. The major federal child care and early education programs, including the Child Care and Development Block Grant, Temporary Assistance for Needy Families Block Grant, and Head Start, have different rules established by federal law and regulations. CCDBG and TANF are the primary sources of child care assistance to help low-income parents afford child care to go to work or to school. Both of these programs have restrictions related to immigrant eligibility that were established in 1996 as part of welfare reform. Next slide, please. We'll start with TANF. States use TANF funds to pay for child care assistance for clients. Federal law prohibits most immigrants, regardless of status, from receiving TANF assistance during their first 5 years in the United States, though many states have used state funds to provide services. After 5 years, qualified immigrants may receive TANF-funded child care. Qualified immigrants is a term that is defined by the federal government and includes lawful permanent residents or green card holders, refugees, and other specific categories of immigrants and asylum seekers. Undocumented immigrants are not eligible for TANF assistance, including child care. In most states, TANF-funded child care is considered to be a benefit for adults, and therefore it's the parent whose eligibility is considered when determining immigrant eligibility. These rules apply to child care assistances funded directly through TANF. TANF funds that are transferred to CCDBG are subject to all CCDBG rules, including immigrant eligibility, which I will discuss next. Next slide, please. CCDBG, as TANF, is defined as a federal public benefit, which means that eligibility is limited to citizens and qualified immigrants. However, CCDBG regulations make clear that CCDBG is a benefit for the child, and therefore only the child's citizenship or immigrant status is relevant, and states may not consider a parent status in their eligibility determination. This is important because if we remember the statistics that you heard from Wendy earlier, the vast majority of children of immigrants are U.S. citizens. Therefore, these restrictions should not apply to most immigrant families, and most children of immigrants would be eligible for CCDBG-funded childcare if they meet other eligibility requirements. CCDBG, just as other federal programs, also prohibits states from requiring the provision of a Social Security number for any household members as a condition of eligibility. If families are asked for a Social Security number on applications, it must be clear that this information is voluntary. Next slide, please. There are also circumstances in which CCDBG eligibility restrictions do not apply. Any child care that is subject to the Head Start performance standards and supported by Head Start and CCDBG funding combined is free of eligibility restrictions or verification requirements. That includes the Early Head Start Child Care Partnerships and other Head Start collaborations. Services that are provided in settings that are subject to public educational standards, including before and after school care in schools, is also exempt from restrictions. Finally, nonprofit organizations are not required to verify the citizenship or immigration status if they are conducting eligibility determinations. In this later case, however, federal regulations do still allow states to have in place immigrant eligibility verification procedures. Next slide. Other than CCDBG and TANF, which are defined as public benefits, other early childhood programs are not considered public benefits and do not have eligibility restrictions related to the citizenship or immigration status of children or parents. We know, of course, that eligibility conditions are not the only barriers or concerns of families, and there are still tremendous fears that families have in access to early childhood programs, particularly in the current climate. But it is important for early childhood stakeholders to understand that in many cases, immigration status is not a legal barrier to early childhood programs. I'll turn it over now to Emily to talk about the impacts of the administration's recent immigration enforcement orders, which of course are deepening families' fears.
Thanks very much, Hannah. And I just lost Hannah's audio, so I'm hoping that folks can hear me.
We can hear you.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to, you can switch to the next slide, please. As Hannah and Wendy mentioned, I am with the Women's Refugee Commission in Washington, D.C. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip the background information on our organization, but you can certainly find it, and I encourage you to take a look at our website, www.womensrefugeecommission.org. Next slide, please. To give us an overview of where we are going, I'm going to do a bit of immigration enforcement and detention 101 to make sure that we all are speaking about these issues from a common understanding. Then I'm going to go over existing DHS policies and procedures affecting family unity before then turning to the impact or anticipated impact of the new executive orders on children and families. And lastly, I'll just close with a few top-line suggestions on interventions and resources for working with the families that you serve and interact with. So next slide, please. To start, I wanted to give an overview of the key federal agencies that are involved in immigration enforcement. I recognize that we have a different level of knowledge among the participants on the call, and so I apologize for those of you who have this information, but I do think it's important to understand the agencies and entities that you may see operating in your community. U.S. Customs and Border Protection, or CBP, is responsible for apprehensions at the border. You may encounter families who were apprehended by CBP at the border and released into the interior, and it's also possible that you may interact with families who have some family members in immigration detention and others, often U.S. citizen children, living in the community. U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, is the agency responsible for carrying out enforcement actions in the interior of the country, often and increasingly with the cooperation of state and local law enforcement. ICE is also charged with immigration detention and removal, or deportation, to use the more colloquial term. And if you have an immigration enforcement take place in your area and a parent is taken into custody or seems to disappear, it is most likely that they are in an ICE detention center. U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, or USCIS, adjudicates affirmative applications for immigration benefits, and it's not an agency you're likely to hear as much about unless you're serving a child who is also applying for special immigrant juvenile status. Those three agencies are all components of the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, but the fourth agency that interacts with immigrant children and families is the Office of Refugee Resettlement. And that is a component of the Department of Health and Human Services that is charged with providing care and custody for unaccompanied children, as you heard Wendy define earlier in the presentation. Some of the children that you encounter may have been in ORR custody after being apprehended by CBP along the border and later reunified with family members in the interior. Next slide, please. Wendy talked about, and I think it's no secret to anyone in the call, that DHS has been ramping up immigration enforcement efforts nationwide. We have seen an increase in raids, and I'll talk a little bit more in a moment about the different enforcement mechanisms that the agency uses. But I do want to note that fear seems to be a large part of the administration strategy as well, by which I mean that ICE or CBP, generally ICE, will conduct a high-profile immigration enforcement action and has essentially fulfilled its enforcement objectives by creating incredible fear in communities that is having, as Wendy discussed, the ripple effect on children. We've seen cases of parents arrested after dropping off their children at school. We've seen the arrest of a woman who went into a court seeking a protection order from an abusive spouse. And we certainly see families who are afraid to access benefits and services, which is a trend that unfortunately we expect to continue in the months and years to come. Next slide, please. Thank you. Interior enforcement can look like a lot of different things. We currently are seeing mostly what is called fugitive operations. These can be carried out both in homes, the sort of home raids where ICE shows up at a house often in the early morning hours and takes an individual and sometimes other members of the family into custody, often while a child is present, as well as the operations that we've seen conducted near school properties. But we also see and have seen in the past, we have not seen as many recently, although I fear that they are to come, large worksite raids. In addition, CBP has been conducting traffic stops, particularly along the northern border, apprehending individuals who are then turned over to ICE for detention and quite often deportation. And lastly, the vast expansion of ICE cooperation with local and state law enforcement through programs like 287G and Secure Communities. I'll talk a little bit more about existing ICE policies and protocols for enforcement actions involving a child, but I want to zoom out for a second and just note that while the agency does have some protocols in place, many of these policies and protocols are currently in flux as a result of the change of administration and the executive orders. And specifically for fugitive operations, there was guidance to the field that has been around for about 10 years that had directed ICE agents, if they arrested an individual and a child was present, to call local child protective services or the local police as the first order of priority, and only to allow a parent to make a care arrangement of their choosing for the child if CPS and police are not a feasible option. I do hope that this protocol will be reordered and reissued, but at this point there's not a lot of clarity about that. Because of the lack of sufficient time of apprehension protocols, we do see and are continuing to see children left behind without a caregiver, as well as significant impact on children's overall well-being. Some of those effects on economic stability, school achievement, and mental health that Wendy discussed earlier. So I just want to ask all of you who interact with children and families to be mindful to and attentive of the possibility that these patterns may be playing out in your communities and the children that you serve, particularly if there have been recent enforcement actions in your area. And also just a flag going back to the fear strategy that children can be affected by the widespread sense of insecurity that we're seeing play out across immigrant communities, even if their family has not been directly affected by an ICE operation. Next slide, please. Just to give you a sense of what happens when a person is apprehended by ICE, generally that individual is sent to an immigration detention facility, and that can be anywhere in the country. As I said, very rarely are they given an opportunity to make childcare arrangements before being taken into custody. Those who have been previously deported from the US, and that seems to be a significant target population of the most recent round of enforcement activities, can be deported very quickly as 36 hours from arrest to being moved down to the border for deportation staging, and they are deported without judicial review. At the same time, if a person makes an asylum claim, they could be detained for months or years while that claim moves through the courts. So children may be separated from parents for a variety of reasons, and those parents may be in different locations and in fact be moving from location to location during the time that they're in custody. Next slide. Getting back to the specifics of today's conversation, I wanted to spend a little time trying to separate fact from rumor, because I know that there are a lot of rumors flying through communities, and there's not a lot of clarity about what the administration is currently doing and is planning to do. But I do want to caveat the next few slides with the big reminder that there are quite a bit of unknowns and policies in flux. And I would commend you to resources that I know CLASP is developing for the latest updates on both what's happening in communities and actions that you all can take in your local jurisdictions and in your individual authorities to make sure that both the families and children that you serve are protected, but that your programs and operations are protected as well. Under the Obama administration, ICE actually did take quite a bit of steps to reduce the risk of collateral consequences of immigration enforcement on children. The policies that I'm going to talk about on this slide and the next remain officially in effect and have not changed. However, ICE is not necessarily complying with them in all instances, and in some instances is seeking to bend the contours of existing policies in ways that allow the agency to make more arrests. Under prosecutorial discretion, which is the first point, ICE agents were directed to prioritize the use of their enforcement resources to detain and remove certain categories of people. Similarly, certain categories of individuals were excluded from prioritization, and one of those categories was parents and caregivers of minor US citizen and lawful permanent resident children. In the Trump administration, prosecutorial discretion still exists in law, but it's no longer being applied to wholesale categories of people, such as the parents of minor children. But I do want to point out, if you encounter a child who's been adversely affected by a parent's arrest, ICE does still have the discretion to release a parent to prevent harm to the child, and it's something that we encourage people to push for. I know that sensitive locations has been an issue of particular concern for many of you, and I do want to note that the ICE sensitive locations memo remains in effect. That memo, if you're not familiar with it, directs ICE personnel to avoid arrests at certain sensitive locations, including child care programs, churches, and schools. Unfortunately, as we've seen, the agency is getting around this limitation by, for example, conducting arrests very close to schools, but not actually on school grounds. I would recommend that child care and early education programs review their safety protocols and seek legal input as necessary so that you know your rights and responsibilities should you find yourself faced with a situation where ICE is attempting to conduct an arrest on your property. Next slide, please. The last big piece of guidance that was put into place under the Obama administration and that remains in effect is ICE's Parental Interest Directive. And this was put in place to ensure that parents who are duly involved with the immigration and child welfare systems can maintain a relationship with their children, comply with a child welfare reunification plan, and participate in court proceedings that affect their custody rights. The directive, as I said, is still in effect. However, we believe that it is presently being modified as a result of the executive orders, and we are likely to see a more limited policy coming forth in the coming weeks and months. We don't know if that will be made public, but I think that it is most likely that the discretion components and a parole provision that allow parents who were deported to return to participate in termination of parental rights proceedings are likely to be removed from the directive. That being said, I do encourage those of you who do work directly with families to use the directive where it is helpful to you and to document how it is or is not being complied with in your local area. Next slide, please. Moving on to the executive orders. So in late January, President Trump signed 2 executive orders related to immigration enforcement: the Border Security and Immigration Enforcement Improvements Executive Order and an executive order on enhancing public safety in the interior of the United States. The implementation of these is difficult to ascertain, but we do know that they are in effect and being rolled out. However, I want to emphasize that the rumored executive order on public benefits has not been signed. And in the absence of a signed public benefits EO, current policies regarding immigrant eligibility for public benefits remain the same. Next slide, please. As I talk a little bit about the contents and effects of the executive orders, I just want to emphasize one more time that, that we're in a very uncertain moment. That being said, we're taking the executive orders at face value, and we are certainly encouraging families to make safety plans in the event that a parent or other caregiver is apprehended, detained, and potentially deported. Moving on to specifics of the orders, they are quite far-reaching. They call for a massive increase in immigration enforcement, detention, and removal. And as I said, they also expand the enforcement priorities list in a way that makes almost every undocumented person an enforcement priority. So anyone who's in the country without status is at risk of arrest, detention, and deportation. However, certain categories of individuals are prioritized. And I know that one of the enforcement priority designations that may be of particular concern to many of you on this call has to do with abuse of public benefits. In fact, abuse of public benefits was called out in the Interior Executive Order as an action that would make somebody a deportation priority. I personally have not heard of case examples of this happening yet, though I'm curious to know if others on the line have, and if so, please feel free to jump in during Q&A, but also I would encourage you to report those cases to CLASP. Next slide. The executive orders also call for rapid deportation of some and prolonged detention of others. They eliminate privacy rights for non-U.S. citizens and LPRs. And I don't know exactly how that will play out with Hannah's admonition that, that privacy protections for NGOs who are determining eligibility for child care assistance do exist. I know that it's something that CLASP is looking into, and I would encourage all of you to seek legal opinions from your own counsel on this subject. One of the other things that is very concerning to us is that the Interior Executive Order spells out the possibility, the Border Executive Order spells out the possibility of prosecution of parents for smuggling their children. So that is a parent who pays a smuggler to bring a child to the United States to keep them safe and to rejoin the parent. The orders also allow for increased fines and penalties, both for unlawfully present individuals and for those who assist them. And I know that's something that is probably of concern for those of you who are on the direct services side of the early childhood education world. I have to say again that we don't have a very clear sense of how these provisions will play out. However, I think it's important to note that separate privacy protections for programs that receive funding from the Department of Education have not changed. Next slide. Wanting to end this on a little bit of a positive note, I did want to flag for you just one top line suggestion on what you can do to help. That being said, I caveat this with the caution that the advice differs depending on the immigration status of the child concerned. If you are serving a U.S. citizen child and you know that that child is being adversely affected by a parent's detention or deportation, you can contact ICE through their detention reporting and information line, that's sometimes called the drill hotline, to raise the case and ask that ICE consider releasing the parent from detention. If the parent's deported, it gets a little bit more complicated, but you can still flag that as a concern. ICE also maintains the parental interests email inbox. I've provided the email address for that there. You can raise similar concerns of adverse consequences for a child, and I recommend that you put parental interest in the subject line to try to elevate those inquiries and requests to individuals within the department who have expertise in dealing with these issues. And in emergency cases where a parent is facing imminent deportation and a child is at risk, you can raise the case to the ICE Parental Interest Coordinator, Andrew Lorenzen Strait, and he was quite happy to provide his contact information for folks on the call. Next slide, please. Turning to children who are not U.S. citizens or lawful permanent residents, it's really important to remember if you are considering intervening to assist a family who's been affected by immigration enforcement, that if a child or the person caring for them is undocumented, please do not contact ICE. Doing so, especially under the current administration, may put that child or their caregiver at risk of apprehension, detention, and deportation. If you are approached by a family who is seeking assistance with an immigration matter, I would suggest that you recommend they speak with an immigration attorney, and the best resource to connect them to is the American Immigration Lawyers Association searchable database at www.alalawyer.org. And last slide, please. I know Lisa's going to talk a lot more about safety planning resources and other tools for assisting children and families. I just wanted to flag a couple that are on the Women's Refugee Commission website. We have one that is specifically geared towards parents who are interested in making a safety plan, and another that the toolkit on detained or deported, what about my children, that is more appropriate for those of you in professional capacities who are assisting families. I know that CLASP is planning to send out a resource list at the end of the call, and I thank them for that. And I just want to note that all of our materials are in the process of being updated and additional resources being developed to comport with the executive orders. So please feel free to check back on our website frequently for that information. Thank you very much, and I will turn it over to Elisa.
Hi, everyone. My name is Elisa Ortiz, and I am with the Appleseed Network, and thank you so much, Emily and Wendy and Hannah at CLASP for organizing this. So I'm going to give you a quick overview of a resource or sort of set of resources that we've been working on at Appleseed. First, next slide, please. So briefly, Appleseed Network is a network of 17 public interest justice centers across the United States and Mexico, connected by the hub office here in DC, which is where I work. So we work on a number of issues, but for many years we've worked on immigration issues, particularly on immigration court reform and encouraging pro bono legal representation of immigrants. And one of our signature pieces that we've sort of updated a couple different times is the manual that I'm going to talk about. Next slide, please. So in 2012 was the last time we released the manual titled Protecting Assets and Child Custody in the Face of Deportation. So we're in the process of updating the manual. So instead of waiting until the whole thing was completed because there's such an urgent need, we've been rolling out chapters as they are completed. So there are many different sections of the manual, including child custody, personal finance, personal property remittances, etc. And so you can, I'll provide the link at the end. So I'm going to focus mostly on, of course, child custody issues since that's most relevant for this audience. The one thing I will say before I continue is that, so myself, I am not a lawyer, and so our manual is designed as guidance, and it's more targeted at folks that work with immigrants and communities and provide direct service to them. But we highly encourage you to consult a lawyer or to encourage folks that you're working with to consult a lawyer to make sure that everything is in order as they do some of the safety planning. Next slide, please. So a quick overview. So we have 3 chapters focused on child custody and children's issues. The first provides guidance in understanding child custody and guardianship issues and in planning custody arrangements before detention or deportation. So a couple things that are really important to keep in mind, and the manual goes into much more depth. I mean, the child custody chapter itself is 19 pages. This is a highly complicated issue. So key considerations: state of residence. Every single state has their own laws and rules about how guardianship is determined and even what it's called. Is it guardianship? Is it power of attorney, etc.? As others have mentioned, the relationship and immigration status of parents, so whether they were married previous to the child being born, whether they're currently married, whether they're divorced, etc. All this has an impact on how child custody lays out. Legal versus physical custody considerations. So as the name would imply, physical custody is who actually has the child sort of living with them. Legal is the person who can make the key decisions about the child in terms of their education, medical, etc. And also custodial rights and their impact on parental rights in the future. Sort of one caution, and once, if you do end up downloading the chapter and reading it, it goes into a lot of depth. So, one option for parents facing deportation is to, hand over custodial rights to someone else. Unfortunately, if they are then not deported, that can have an impact on their long-standing parental rights. These are all considerations, and again, why we encourage people to consult a lawyer. And then finally, there's some information on what happens if a child ends up in the child welfare system. Next slide, please. So a couple sort of quick sketch on doing safety planning basics, and I think I also want to definitely encourage you to check out Emily and the Women's Refugee Commission's safety planning stuff as well. But a couple of guidelines here from our manual. So, someone, as I mentioned, needs to designate a caregiver, and that person ideally needs to be a U.S. citizen or have legal status. Someone who can, provide care to the child if and when the parent's deported. So, they need to identify that person, someone they trust, and then inform, you all and other child care providers, education professionals, et cetera, about who that caregiver is in case a parent doesn't arrive to pick up their child, and they obviously need someone to take care of them. The parent should collect all important documents, birth certificates, if they have a passport, medical and school records, try to make sure that it's extremely detailed, especially, if the child has medical issues, that there's a lot of details about what that means and how to do it so that whoever has to take on care can, has something ready-made. And then the, sort of critical thing in terms of consulting a lawyer is setting up this guardianship and power of attorney if possible. And again, every single state is different. Some allow what they call standby guardianship or springing guardianship, where once a parent is no longer accessible through deportation or other ways. I mean, that could also include medical problems that that somebody then retains custody of the child. There's lots of different ways, so it is important to to be cognizant of the state, and then of the state that someone lives in. And then finally, discuss the plan with children, family, and other essential people. This is sort of all from the perspective of the parents preparing. I mean, this is not an easy issue, right, for anybody to have to face and for anyone to talk about. And I'll mention it again at the end, but we are working with a group of psychologists to develop a chapter specifically on how to work with children and how to talk to them based on their different ages and cognition levels about what this means about deportation and what it could mean if their parents have to go away. But it's important for the parent to also discuss it with family and other essential people so that there's not kind of a scramble, or so that folks know who to go to and who to call to figure out where the child is. Next slide, please. So that's, again, the focus on child custody issues. The other piece I wanted to highlight is the assets and benefits of minor children. I know you might not intersect with this as much, but depending on what your role is or how you work with different parents, it is important to think about. So basically, right, minors usually can't own property. So if their parents are removed or deported, the parents' assets are not then available to the child, right? So that could mean the house they own or the apartment they rent, any of their money and bank accounts. So we do encourage, and the manual has detailed information, parents to consider transferring custodialship or trusteeship to another adult. That way their child's not left kind of without any resources, or the custodian, his or herself, is left without any resources. Next slide. The last part of the 3 chapters I mentioned, the last chapter is enhancing safety in public schools. And I think, you know, Hannah touched on this, Emily touched on a little bit as well. What's important here is to research what your local school district's policy is or is not in this regard. So I think the good thing is that a vast majority of school districts have policies to protect students, but not all. And, you know, they should, I've actually Googled my local school district and found out their policy pretty quickly. And it is good for parents to know, right, what, you know, if ICE comes to the school, kind of what their approach is. And I won't go into too much detail because I think Emily and Hannah did a good job of this, but just mention quickly the legal protections. The Federal Education Rights and Privacy Act and the National School Lunch Act, which does apply to early childhood programs administered by local education agencies or receiving Education Department funds. And then the Privacy Act, which is applicable to child care assistance in Head Start. These, again, Hannah mentioned it, but kind of limit what schools or what providers can disclose to law enforcement. And a order for deportation or removal is not cause for them to release this information. So there are some legal protections that that do exist here, that parents can essentially not necessarily take advantage of sort of directly, but know that their child's information and their information isn't just going to be released. Next slide. So I'll wrap up. And by mention, again, the chapter on the psychological impacts of deportation on children is coming. The other thing, as I've sort of mentioned over and over again, is that every single state is different here. And so we are working with an extensive, amazing team of pro bono attorneys around the country to gather state-by-state forms and legal guidance on child custody issues, and then on power of attorney on sort of financial and other matters. And we're working on collecting that. It is much more complicated than it should be, and than we originally thought it would be. But as those state-by-state forms become available, we'll make them available. They'll be on our website. So for more information to review the entire manual, which is broken down chapter by chapter, so you can download individual chapters, you know, whatever is most relevant to you, visit our website, appleseednetwork.org/deportation manual. And then I've also put a link here. So we already have released 17 chapters, as I mentioned, but we have several more that are still in the process of being updated. And so if you'd like to receive email updates when new chapters are released, you can visit this bit.ly link and sign up for the email list. And, you know, I think we're hoping to release most of the rest of the chapters in the next couple of months, and also working on Spanish translation of the manual as well. And again, all of those updates in terms of when chapters and Spanish translations will be released will be sent out through that email list. So thank you so much, and I'll turn it back to Wendy, I believe.
Thanks, Elisa. Thank you very much. I just want to, I've been getting a lot of questions about this in the chat box. I just want to flag once again that everyone will be getting all of the slides following this webinar. We'll send out a copy of the PowerPoint as well as additional resources. And I also got a note from our friends over at the National Immigration Law Center, thank you, to quickly just clarify that when we talk about abuse of public benefits under the Interior Enforcement Order, that abuse of public benefits has been defined as knowingly defrauding the government or public benefit program. And although the enforcement order limits the rights under the Privacy Act to U.S. citizens and lawful permanent residents, an array of federal and state privacy and civil rights laws to protect public benefit recipients remain in place. So that's really important to know, that someone is not necessarily at risk of deportation unless they knowingly defraud the government in order to use the public benefit program. And then, so in order to wrap up, next slide please, I'll wrap up by just quickly summing up some of the ways early childhood stakeholders can support immigrant children and families in their programs, some of which were covered today. First, providers can reassure students and parents that programs are currently safe from intrusion by ICE and ensure all personnel familiar with the sensitive locations policy and other relevant internal policies. Of course, this is with the caveat that Emily mentioned that these policies are still under review and may change in the future. Second, providers can also promote welcoming learning environments that lift up different cultures, celebrate diversity, and encourage tolerance. Third, programs can review existing policies and procedures to ensure they are in compliance with federal requirements such as FERPA, and consider additional policies that will prevent the inappropriate record and release of immigration status. Providers can also connect parents to information, know your rights materials, safety planning resources like those that were highlighted today, and connect families to resources in the community such as legal services, mental health services, and the like. Finally, providers can consider partnering with community-based organizations to hold on-site Know Your Rights and other informational workshops for families in a safe place. Next slide, please. And here are some resources from our respective organizations, including links to the materials from Women's Refugee Commission and Appleseed, and a new fact sheet that was just released today by CLASP on the 5 ways Trump's immigration enforcement orders harm children. And next slide, please. And here are some additional resources, many also referenced during today's webinar, and I should flag that we'll be sending a longer list of resources and the follow-up information that we send to all participants along with the recording and copy of today's webinar. Next slide. And in the interest of time, I'm just going to do this quickly. Next slide, please. The team at CLASP also wanted to flag that we're launching a data collection project to get a better understanding of how young children and families are being impacted by these new immigration policies. We plan to speak with a diverse range of individuals and organizations across the country, so please, if you have information or stories to share, we know that you all are seeing this on the ground and we really want to hear from you. Please contact us at the email and number here. And like I said, we will be sending this around so that you have it. Okay. It's time to get to some of your questions, and we have a lot of them, so I'm going to get started with one that was sent to us before the webinar, which is, can children travel by themselves if the decision is made to send them back with their parents to their different countries? Elisa, can you take that?
Well, I think Emily might have some insight on this one too, but it does depend on how they're going to get there. So different airlines have different policies, and I'm not sure whether the person who asked the question is talking about the child literally traveling by themselves or traveling with the parent as the parent's being deported. And so it does depend a little bit. I would definitely refer you to the child custody chapter of our manual that has some more details on what specifically happens and options for parents facing deportation. Emily, did you have any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, I will just add that as long as the family is not concerned about interaction with their home government, contacting the consulate can sometimes be very helpful. The consulates can facilitate and arrange travel for children, and sometimes can even designate a consular official to travel with a young child. And in the ICE Parental Interest Directive, the agency is supposed to facilitate the reunification of a family member if that's what the parent desires. Legally, they can't put a U.S. citizen child on one of the flights that ICE operates as one of the deportation flights that the agency operates, but they can decide to put a parent on a commercial airliner. One thing that I will note is that if it is an instance, and you are unlikely to see these cases, but it is possible, where the family is taken into custody at the same time and a child is placed in Office of Refugee Resettlement custody, just because the child or the parent's immigration case comes to a conclusion does not mean that the other family member's case has come to a conclusion. So in those instances, the family cannot be removed and or travel at the same time. That's a common misconception that we hear from people, that if a parent takes a deportation, their kid can come with them regardless.
Great, thanks. The next question we have is, what about families facing domestic violence issues? Does the Violence Against Women Act still stand? Emily, I'm going to guess that you might be able to answer that.
Yeah, it's not my area of expertise, and if there's if folks from NOC are still on the phone and have any insights, please feel free to send an email to Wendy or me. But yes, the Violence Against Women Act does still exist, though we have seen ICE operations that are having a chilling effect on survivors, particularly the the actions, the enforcement actions that we've seen carried out at courthouses, and in fact, DOJ has articulated that courthouses, in their interpretation, are not a protected space. So I do think that there's a gap between what the law has put in place and what people feel that they are reasonably able to access in reality, given the risk of detection and apprehension in their local community and in their particular case. I don't know, Wendy, if you have anything to add. Great,
I was
just
going to add, I encourage people to reach out to ASISTA, A-S-I-S-T-A.
Yes.
They work at the intersection of domestic violence, sexual assault, and immigration issues.
Thank you, Elisa. All right, the third question is, actually, I'm going to get over to Hannah, which is the participant is asking, I work at a nonprofit that has a preschool. We receive scholarships through Quality First. In order to receive the scholarship, children must provide a birth certificate. Is this legal?
So I believe the person is asking about scholarships that are paid for through CCDBG, so the Federal Child Care Assistance. So then the question of whether a birth certificate can be required. Oftentimes birth certificates are requested to verify age, verify household relationships or composition. It is unusual to require only one particular document for verification, so it may be that there's a list of acceptable documents which could include a birth certificate, but the question then is specifically asking about the verification as a nonprofit, and so I did mention the nonprofit exemption. This is a little bit confusing. If the nonprofit is determining eligibility for the scholarships, then the state or the lead child care agency cannot require your nonprofit agency to do that verification of immigration status for children in your program. But the state is permitted to have procedures in place to verify and document eligibility. Remember, the eligibility restrictions in CCDBG only apply to the child, but as long as the nonprofit preschool is not required to do the requesting, it is common for a birth certificate to be one of many requested documents for CCDBG funded childcare. But I would urge the person who asked the question to follow up with us individually, and we can get a more specific answer to that circumstance.
Okay, thank you, Hannah. Our next question is, can undocumented immigrants foster or adopt a child, and can they care for a child once a parent is deported? Emily, I'll give that to you, and I can add to it if you need me to.
I was actually going to say, Wendy, maybe you want to take a start on that.
Well, undocumented immigrants are not, and it varies by state, but typically do not need to be a U.S. citizen. They don't have to, their immigration status should not matter in terms of being able to foster a child, but it does create challenges. And in cases where a parent is deported, it is highly recommended. We encourage parents to identify a caregiver that is a U.S. citizen, ideally, in order to prevent any of the barriers that might get created down the road. So that's the answer to that question. Emily, did you want to add anything?
That's great. Thanks, Wendy.
Okay. So the next question I have here is, do parents need a passport from their country of origin in order to return to that country if they're either deported or choose to return? Elisa or Emily?
I can take this. So there is a distinction in some ways between whether a parent is deported or chooses to return. They still do need travel documents in both instances. Obviously, if a person chooses to go home of their own volition, yes, they need a passport to travel, certainly to get on board a plane leaving the United States. If an individual is deported, ICE will seek travel documents from their government prior to being able to deport them. There are certainly instances where governments decline to issue travel documents, and the executive orders do touch on what to do in cases of, I think they call them intractable countries, who are not willing to cooperate, but that can result in an individual remaining in deportation for long periods of time. I also just want to, on the issue of passports, mention passports for children as well. In many instances, certainly in the case of children of Mexican parents, a child is entitled to Mexican citizenship as well as to U.S. citizenship. But it's really important in any instance that a parent chooses to take a child with them to their home country or have that child follow to join them post-deportation, that the child's birth be registered with the home country's government. It will facilitate travel. They may need a visa to enter the home country, and they certainly need things like school records, health and vaccination records, and the like to be able to integrate and access services and benefits in the parent's home country. So as part of safety planning, and I say this because I know, Elisa, I had to jump off a few minutes early, collection of those sorts of documents and application for a passport for U.S. citizen children are things that we really encourage families to be thinking about and acting on now.
Great, thanks. The next question we have is, how long does a detainee have to get in touch with their family or their children once they've been detained? And yeah, that's the question.
Okay,
Emily?
yeah, so the apprehension process often happens in a couple of different stages. Somebody can be apprehended by CBP, by ICE, or by local and state police. I'm going to set CBP aside because I think that's the instance that we are, that you all are least likely to encounter. If somebody is apprehended by ICE, they are taken into custody and they are usually transferred to an ICE detention center fairly quickly. They may be put in a temporary, they call them under 72-hour facility, while they're being moved to the facility elsewhere in the country where they're going to be for a longer period of time. ICE is supposed to give everybody a 3-minute phone call upon arrival at the long-term post-72-hour immigration detention facility. But it can be as long as 72 hours, if not longer, before an individual gets that phone call. For a person who's apprehended by state or local law enforcement and then transferred to ICE, ICE places a detainer, also known as a hold, on that person, saying when you're finished with them, local and state police, we want to consider taking them into custody. They often will get a phone call as provided to anybody who's taken into custody by police. They'll call home and say, I'm in police custody, not recognizing that there may be a detainer placed on them and that they may be transferred to ICE custody within a matter of hours, days, weeks, months, what have you. So we've seen these cases of parents who get apprehended for something like driving without a license, spend the night in holding facility, go before a judge who says, oh yeah, you have a driver's license, I'm going to let you go, call your family and let them know. The parent calls their family and says, I'm being released in the morning, not aware of the fact that ICE is intending to take that individual into custody, comes and picks them up the next morning, takes them to an immigration detention center, and it's several days or weeks before the family member hears from them. So these ghosting situations can happen. I know this is a long answer, but I do think it's important for folks to know some of the situation that may be playing out if it seems like a parent disappears very quickly.
Thank you. And we're getting actually a lot of questions related specifically to eligibility for public benefits, one of them being are undocumented children eligible for federally funded health care? And I can just address this question really quickly by saying that that typically it varies by state, and some states have, there's varying rules depending on the state. Undocumented children are typically not eligible for government-funded, federally funded health care, but certain states do cover undocumented children regardless of their immigration status. And I would recommend that folks visit the National Immigration Law Center website, where they have a really helpful interactive map that highlights specifically the rules regarding healthcare coverage in different states. And we're now at 2:59, and we have many other questions, and I just want to repeat, just reiterate that this is not the end of this conversation. We're going to compile these questions and figure out the best way to get these answers, get as many answers to you as possible. We will be following up with additional resources, as well as a recording of today's webinar. For those of you who are asking for materials in Spanish and other languages, I do believe that both the Women's Refugee Commission and APLC will be making their materials available, at least in Spanish, and I think other languages potentially down the road. I just want to thank all our speakers for joining us today, and thank all of you for taking the time out of your day to join us. We really appreciate it, and we look forward to keeping in touch. Thank you.